Hi, everybody. Today is Wednesday, May 21st, and our friend Daniel McAdams is back with us. Welcome back, Daniel.
Thanks so much for having me back, Nima. It's great to be with you again and see you again.
When it comes to the Trump administration and the policy in the Middle East, Daniel, how do you see the way that they're somehow managing? I don't know if we can call it managing. They're somehow dealing with the case of the Middle East, because right now in Gaza, as we know, the pressure on Gazans and Palestinians is tremendous. Your take on what's going on there?
Pardon me, it's extreme, and I think one of the sort of bright parts of the whole thing is that people are starting to notice. I mean, you're seeing, for example, in the conservative circles in the United States, which have been propagandized away from concern over Palestinians because, oh, Palestinians, they're just a bunch of leftist radicals in the universities. So there's been a shift now where you can see, for example, the American Conservative Magazine, which is, one of the sort of, focus areas of conservative thought in the U.S. They've published several articles, including a couple terrific ones by George O'Neill. There's one out today. John Hoffman has a piece out today in there. And so you're starting to see some concern among conservatives in the United States for this policy. And I think that pressure is being felt by the administration. For many of us, not strongly enough, and the response is not strong enough. But however, you're starting to see some response. You're starting to see some frustration. President Trump is said to have conveyed to Netanyahu his concern over the suffering in Gaza and that he would like to see them end this, wrap it up, I think was the word that was quoted. Now that could have a couple of meanings. One of them is not very pleasant. He always leaves this wide open, but it's clear to him, I think now, and through the polls, you've seen a real shift in the American public perception of our relationship with Israel. Most recently, the Gallup and Pew polls have shown that the majority of Americans don't back Israel. And that's just a fact. And it's even a majority among Republicans. And so all of this is coming together, I think, and putting some pressure on the administration to finally make some moves in Gaza. Now, it'll be too little too late, in my opinion, and many of our opinions. But at least you're starting to see that shift in that direction.
When it comes to the public opinion in the United States, we know that one of the main reasons that Joe Biden and Democratic Party has lost the presidential election was the case of Palestine, the case of Gazans. And do you think that the political parties in the United States are somehow getting to the point to understand the importance of what's going on in the Middle East in terms of the public opinion in the United States, but because they're going to be directly influenced by the situation in the Middle East, the future of their party and their position if they want to be the president of the United States. We know that many people voted for Donald Trump because they didn't see anything coming from the Democratic Party in terms of Palestine.
Well, I mean, I think there's an ideological crisis throughout the Western world. You see increasingly the two opposing parties are virtually identical when it comes to their philosophy of government, the principles by which they stand, the positions that they take in both foreign and domestic policy. And when there's an outlier party or candidate, for example, we've just seen it in Romania, we're also seeing it in Germany and in France. When there's an outlier, they're labeled extreme, even though when you actually examine the policies, for example, of the AfD in Germany, they're not extreme at all. They're basically very mainstream U.S. Republican parties, 1995 or something. So you're seeing this crisis where the partisan politics is becoming superfluous because it's not driven by any competing ideas. And I think you're seeing that in the United States. People voted for Trump, especially on foreign policy, because he recognized that the Biden administration was completely hapless when it came to foreign policy. They weren't capable of making or acting on any decisions. It was in auto drive mode, if that could be said. And so I think Trump coming out and recognizing that, saying I'm the peace president, I'll be the peace president, myself included, I was hoping that he would win because at least there's a chance for some change for the better. But you also have this sort of bifurcation in American society between, in one direction, the sort of, I would say, the leading edge of philosophical thought is carried by the American voter, and that's why I think you're seeing the polls moving in one direction. But there's a trailing edge of the donor class, and they are resistant to change, and they're the ones that put people in power. They're the ones that elect members of Congress, and they're propelled by very, very strong lobbies. And those strong lobbies get you the kinds of neocon policy, the kinds of big spending policy, regardless of party. The parties have become almost identical now. So the donors, the people that make Congresses, that make the makeup of Congress comes from, they want things to stay the same. So I think there's increasing tension in American society between the population and the donor class, and I don't know where that will end.
Yeah. Does is the donor class even concerned of what's going on with the public opinion, or they don't care about what's going on? The main agenda would remain the same. How is that going to? Because my question, Daniel, many people don't understand what's going on in the United States. Donald Trump came to power promising that he's going to put an end to the conflict in Ukraine and doing something with Israel. None of those promises have been materialized so far. How when the reality would hit the political parties, Donald Trump is somehow an outsider to the system. But when you look at his administration, most of them are part of the system. You just remove J.D. Vance and Witkoff and Tulsi Gabbard, maybe uh, Patel. The rest of the administration is the same.
That's why it was kind of shocking, Trump's speech in Saudi Arabia, where he railed against neocons and interventionists, because I wonder if anyone told him that those are the people who make up nearly the entirety of his administration. I mean, he's basically railing against the people that he chose to run his government for him. And it's a very odd situation. The question about Trump being successful in Ukraine and in the Middle East is, it's basically as if you go to the doctor and he tries to treat your illness, but he misdiagnoses your illness, you're never going to get better. And Trump has never understood, the people around him have never really understood the Ukraine crisis, what's happened in Ukraine. They don't understand the antecedents. They don't understand that the Ukraine crisis was born out of interventionism in the first place, and not just Maidan in 2014, but the meddlings in the early 2000s. The Orange Revolution, for example, set the stage for what happened later. So if the problem is caused by American interventionism in Ukraine, you can't solve it with more interventionism. The solution that Trump should have taken, the off ramp was right there. As he would say, a big, beautiful off ramp appeared before him when he was elected, and it's called do nothing. Pull out, no more weapons, no more intel, no more money, no more support, and let the chips fall where they may. And it would have been an extremely easy and productive process, but he could not resist. It's like the Lord of the Rings. Maybe I can use the ring to do good. And that's what he wanted to do. So he's misdiagnosed it. And so that's why we're sitting here with successions of the Kellogg proposal. This is an article that General Keith Kellogg and Fred Fleitz, who's a big neocon, they wrote last year, and they published it last year, and it was DOA last year because it misread the crisis. It presupposed things that were just not true, i.e., that Russia was losing, that it was just desperate to get out of this war, and if we just give them a little something, a ceasefire, they'll jump at it. Anyone who's followed this, and I know most of the people on your show would say the same thing. It's an absolute fantasy world. So you can't solve a problem if you can't completely misdiagnose the problem.
How do you find the relationship right now between Netanyahu and Donald Trump? Do you think that they're somehow closer? They're getting much more some sort, or we're gonna see a very substantial division as time goes by?
Well, on the one hand, the Trump administration is extraordinarily pro-Israel. It's unprecedented, and it goes from people that run the HHS, all the way down to it's extraordinarily pro-Israel. But I think you have kind of a clash of personalities behind between a Trump and a Netanyahu. I'm still not convinced that this recent clash is genuine. I don't know, maybe it's manufactured by the media to show that Trump is frustrated with Netanyahu because he's looking that most Americans are frustrated with Netanyahu and they're sick, frankly, they're sick of him. And so maybe that is something that's been manufactured. I had felt that it was manufactured in advance of Trump's visit to the Middle East, which would be very important if he's going to sit down with people from Saudi Arabia and Qatar and UAE, that it's seen that there is some friction in his relationship with Netanyahu that would make for a more successful trip. I'm still not convinced that that's incorrect, but I do think that Trump also has to understand the growing frustration as we spoke about earlier in U.S. society, and it's crossing partisan lines now with what's happening in the Middle East.
I think what's going on in the mind of Trump, maybe, or his administration, is that what's going on in the Middle East, how is it going to benefit the United States in a long run? You look at his trip to Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar, in which he was gaining, he was getting much more investment in the United States. But you look at the case of Israel, they have to give everything as Israel needs to fight this war in the Middle East. And the bigger picture, by the way, with the case of Iran, if we bring the case of Iran and the nuclear program of Iran and the way they're trying to talk to each other, you see the bigger picture, which is the fight between the United States, economic fight between the United States and China, the bigger picture. And here comes the question, how does the United States want the Middle East to be for the in a long run? Do they want to make, we know that Donald Trump has he has put pressure on Saudi Arabia to go after that Abraham Accords, but they're not going to go there before the United States admitting or Israel admitting to have a Palestinian state. This shows how the situation in the Middle East has been changing during the recent years. How do you see Donald Trump seeing the Middle East in a long run?
Well, there was a fascinating article in Politico of all places in their magazine section of the publication around the time when Trump was signing all these deals, and the crux of it, you may have read it. The crux of it was essentially Trump is going over and signing deals for however many $1 trillion. A lot of that's for show, but nevertheless, the impression is there that when Trump goes to the Middle East, he does business with countries like Saudi Arabia and UAE and Qatar, and he's bringing home money and jobs. And certainly the people at Boeing who are going to build those planes are quite happy to have these jobs in the future. And on the other hand, there's this perception now, there's one country that we seem to that only seems to take and never to give. They don't give us any jobs. They don't give us any manufacturing. They don't give us peace in the Middle East anymore either. In fact, they're at war with all of their neighbors. They occupy territory from all of their neighbors. And there's this impression that this is a problem. And I think the article pointed out that within Israel it's a problem because they're looking around and realizing that there's a great sucking sound. Israel sucking money out of our pockets, sucking our credibility out of the Middle East. The fact that we're tied to the hip with a country that is universally hated now after the slaughter of maybe 50 or 60 or more thousand people, primarily women and children. That this has become a liability for the United States. And the old neocon arguments that, well, we have to stand with our greatest ally, the greatest democracy in the Middle East, that argument now looks as tired as a, avocado-colored shag rug, as old-fashioned as the 70s. So there's a massive shift, I think, that's going on, and Israel is not contributing anything to the United States, and more Americans are starting to recognize that. The problem is we have extremist groups in the United States who are not Jewish, by the way, who feel a strange cult-like attraction to a secular state that just appeared in 1948 out of the blue, out of the ashes of the Holocaust and World War II, and they feel some sort of some sort of an apocalyptic relationship with this country. And you know very well, Nima, when people s- religious extremism can cause people to toss logic to the wind and even their own self-interest to the wind. And so that's a big problem in the United States right now. And it's going to be very difficult to deprogram people who hold these theories.
Daniel, when you look at the Trump administration, do you see that there are two sort of branches somehow fighting each other in terms of the foreign policy of the United States, or they're trying to get along with each other as and they're keeping their differences?
No, I think you can see some factions, and you pointed out earlier. I think JD Vance, certainly when it comes to Ukraine, less so perhaps with the Middle East, but certainly with Ukraine, he recognizes that this is a loser for the United States, that continuing the Biden policy is a loser. I think deep down he understands that the Kellogg approach is an absolute non-starter. I mean, President Trump kept sending Witkoff to Moscow with the same proposal. Hey, how about a 30-day ceasefire? No thanks, we don't want it. Hey, how about a 30-day ceasefire? No thanks, we don't want it. Finally, when he wanted to go back again, Putin said, "Look, don't bother. You know, I mean, I've heard the song and dance before. This is not what we're interested in. So if that's all you're bringing to the table, you know, we're not interested in you trying to solve this problem for us. Let's talk about some other things, which Trump and Putin did earlier this week."
We Today Lavrov said there is no ceasefire. We're not going to talk about ceasefire because that means something else to us. You're going to rebuild the Ukrainian army to fight us. And on the part of the Trump administration, they're pushing so hard. They're doing everything to make a ceasefire between the two parties. And with the latest phone call between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump, right after the call, he said they have to find a solution. They have to talk to each other. Do you see Zelensky interested in putting an end to the conflict, in finding a solution, being realistically uh, oriented by what's going on the battlefield?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, you know, when I started doing foreign policy, you know, well over 30 years ago, to date myself, I've always admired how smart people seemed when they were doing foreign policy. I looked up to people who were great theorists and such. And now that I've been doing it for quite some time, I realize depressingly how dumb most people are that are in power. I mean, the presumption among foreign policy professionals or people that are at least that are elected to do that or the representatives, the presumption that when you're winning a war, you rush to the table to sign a ceasefire is unprecedented in history. No country does it. You know, if you're in the fourth quarter of the football game and you're up two touchdowns, you don't go to sign an agreement saying, "Okay, let's just call it a tie." You know, it's just basic logic. You don't have to have a PhD. You don't have to have years in think tanks to understand that this doesn't happen. And that's the problem. It's garbage in, garbage out. They don't believe what everyone else sees on the battlefield, what everyone else sees that's happened over the past 3 years. They don't understand it, and they've been driven by narratives continuously, and that brings us back to your point about Zelensky. And Zelensky increasingly finds himself in a corner. You know, his games, his antics, all of his foolishness now I think is being very very well perceived by the administration. They see what they're dealing with. This ridiculous uh, going to Ankara to meet with Erdogan and forcing the two delegations to not be able to speak for 24 hours after telling them that they couldn't speak at all, that only he and Putin could personally talk, which is absurd. Anyone who understands the basics of diplomacy understands that you deal with these things on a working level first, and then you have the leaders come and you have a ceremony and they sign and they shake hands. You know, Yalta, we remember all this stuff from history. So all of these antics are designed to keep the conflict going, which is what Zelensky needs. It must happen. It must keep going because when the conflict stops and he looks around for a chair to sit on, there's not going to be any chairs, and it's going to be pretty ugly for him because the rest of the country is also going to wake up to the fact that he's killed 1 million of the you know of their men. And many women as well, you know, and there's going to be a little bit of a Mussolini effect. Let's just put it that way.
I don't understand why Donald Trump is incapable of putting an end, at least not sending any more intelligence weapons to Ukraine. Because do you think that the way that Donald Trump wasn't able to put an end to the conflict is related to the way that he's been somehow communicating with Europe? Is that the pressure from Europe that is forcing them not being able to do anything in Ukraine, or is something within the administration? They have some sort of differences, and these differences coming from within the administration.
Well, one of the bright spots about Trump is that he doesn't hold Europe in very high regard. The current leadership of European countries, the level is pretty low, and that's not even starting with European bureaucrats. With von der Leyen and Kaya Kallas, and these people are very, very low character, very, very low intellect, and very corrupt as well. So I think, to his credit, Trump doesn't give them a lot of attention or respect. But I'm not a psychologist, but I wonder if a lot of it for Trump is ego. I promised to end this war, and I'm going to end this war. Well, sometimes the solution out of a puzzle is nearer than it seems. Sometimes the way out is much more clear if you just step back and take a deep breath. And I think Trump could understand that. He could still pull it away with a win. I think as long as he doesn't go down the path of sanctions again, he can still pull a win out of this. And he simply just has to say, look, the American people, it's very clear from the polls, they're tired of this war. They're tired of the money we spent. I have already said, and this is what came out of the discussion between Trump and Putin, I have already said that it's now up for the two sides to work it out, and I'm going to let them do that. Now, that ignores a lot of realities, which is that the U.S. is on one side, not Ukraine. Ukraine is only a proxy. This is a U.S.-Russia war, and it has been from the beginning, from 2014 at least. But that aside, this is a way you wiggle out of it, and most people aren't going to say, aha. The U.S. is a participant in this war, so if you want the war to end, stop being a participant. This has absolutely nothing to do with U.S. national interest. It doesn't matter who rules eastern Ukraine. It doesn't make a bit of difference to us. It doesn't make a difference if NATO expanded or not expanded. Why would we have taken such huge risks and forced this war for an outdated alliance that should have been completely shut down at the end of the Cold War? It makes absolutely no sense. Of course, unless you look at the beneficiaries, which are the weapons manufacturers, the bureaucrats, the politicians, and the NGOs, and all of these things. This is sort of a force unto itself that keeps moving forward.
Donald Trump keeps saying that this is not my war, this is Biden's war. And when you look at his first term, he's bragging about sending javelins, sending all those weapons to Ukraine. And we remember how the sanctions by the United States in those days were so much uh, effective. I cannot say effective, but they were putting a lot of sanctions on Russia in those days during the Trump administration 1.0. Right now, before coming to power, he said that I have nothing to do with the war in Ukraine. He made a new rhetoric. He had the opportunity to put an end to the conflict, to get out of this complexity in Ukraine. But it seems like as time goes by, he's losing that position. He's becoming part of the problem. This war is becoming the Trump's war. Do you
Yeah,
feel he's heading toward the point that I'm mentioning?
it's schizophrenic. On the one hand, it's not my war. On the other hand, I gave them beautiful javelins. I gave them lots of beautiful javelins. So people. I hate to be uncharitable, but it starts sounding buffoonish. It doesn't sound like a serious person when he says things like this. But if it isn't his war, then why is he making it his war? It's like he keeps threatening to leave. It's like he's an abusive partner. He keeps, I'm gonna leave, and the other one says, okay, okay, no, I mean it this time. I'm really gonna leave. Both sides want him out of it. They don't want to participate. The U.S. is not wanted in this process, so just leave. That's the problem. He just can't leave. And he should. If he should, it would be over very soon because Zelensky would realize the pressure that's on him from both sides. Now, from the side of the extremists, the Banderites, who would be furious if he backed down at all, and from the sides of the families of the people that have been slaughtered there unnecessarily and the destruction that's happened. It's all going to be on his back, and he's going to have to figure out something to do. And if I were him, and it probably would do, is just jump on a plane and get out of there. Find some island, go to the Maldives or whatever. Go to an island somewhere, and let everyone else sort it out.
We can talk about Donald Trump and the way that he wasn't being able to do whatever he was talking about before coming to power. But at least in the United States, you hear people in the administration talking about putting an end to the conflict. This war should end as soon as possible. You don't hear that coming from the European countries. Do you understand what's going on in their mind and what is the benefit coming out of the continuation of the conflict in Ukraine for them?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could be alive 100 years from now and see the history as it's written of this era because it will be. There must have been times in the past where such insanity had taken over. Maybe the tulip boom or something like this. There had to have been, or the burning of witches or whatever. I mean, it's a bizarre situation. I think it's certainly it's a matter of low caliber, but these low caliber people have staked their entire reputation on this war, on somehow defeating Russia. And I think you also have a population that had suffered several years of extreme COVID lockdowns and manipulations and distortions of society, and they were already war weary. And so you don't see them standing up to the leadership that's clearly not up to the task, that has the idea that somehow NATO has dumped everything it possibly could dump into this war, and it has all failed against Russia because, very simply, Russia views it as an existential crisis. Just as in Afghanistan, they viewed securing their own state and getting the invaders out as an existential issue, and they're successful. When you fight a war for your homeland, what you perceive to be your homeland, you will do anything it takes to win. And that's not the case for Europe, despite the domino theory rhetoric that's so old and disproven over time that if Putin eats that chunk of eastern Ukraine, he's going to be starving for Poland. What is he going to do with Poland if he gets it? It's the most absurd, bizarre jingoism that you can imagine. But they've staked everything on this, and they see it falling apart before them, and they're incapable of turning from a policy that's clearly failing, that's clearly destroying their economies. I mean, I never thought I would live to see a time when the industrial powerhouse Germany is on its knees, but that's exactly what we're seeing. It's absolutely shocking.
And with the new Chancellor of Germany, Merz, do you think that things gonna get better or they're gonna be hugely in problem?
Well, they're the same. I mean, he's just the same. The only party that has a different view. Well, there are some on the left. There's Sarah Wagenknecht party that had a different view, but they didn't do very well, unfortunately, in the last election. But they certainly had a different perspective. The strongest party in the country right now is AfD. When you look at the recent polls, they're in number one place, and we're talking about them being banning the number one party is astonishing. But my guess is the same is true. Certainly, it's true in Romania, where you actually we've now seen intervention in the election on behalf of the ultimate successor. We're seeing Pavel Durov, the founder of Telegram, said that he was visited by French intelligence and he was told, you've got to silence conservative voices. And he said he's willing to testify. George Simeon, the loser in the election, after, of course, his predecessor as a candidate, Georgescu, was simply not allowed to run for reasons that don't make any sense. He said that he'll challenge the election, and there'll be proof there. The French intelligence has admitted that they've talked to Durov. They characterize it differently, but you're having this situation where anyone with a different view is being demonized in Europe. And of course, it's true in the United States, but it's much worse in Europe now. So Mertz, no, he's not going to make any changes. It'll be interesting to see what he does with the Taurus missiles, though, because he goes back and forth. He's going to send him. He's not going to send him. He's going to send him. He's not going to send him. And if you think back to that intercepted phone call with the German intelligence and military personnel who said, the generals who said that, well, the problem with sending tourists is that we're going to have to actually guide them and fly them into, into Russian cities. And that could be a problem. So, well, that'll be one point I think where we'll see what happens. But he's backed into a wall himself too. What is he going to do? What are the policies he's going to pursue? He's inherited sadly a dead republic.
And the case of Taurus missile, I think that would be hugely risky if they go in that direction, and that could hugely escalate the situation in Ukraine. Don't you think that decision? It seems to me that would be difficult for Mets to make that decision.
Well, it seems to me, just from some things we're hearing from President Putin, that he's gearing up to, and he used the word war, which he has not used before. It was always a special military operation. I mean, I don't know, of course, I'm not privy to any information, but I get a sense that he's looking at a final escalation to finish these things off. And if you watch the movement on the battlefield, you can see well, people say they're moving very slow, but again, it's a war of attrition, not a war for territory. And they're set up in a situation where, in several places like Petrovsk, for example, that they take these strategic hubs and they'll be cutting off supply lines, and you could see a collapse. So I think it seems to me, at least, that that's what he's gearing for. So you throw in Tauruses there when they're ready for a serious advance. You're right, the risk is extremely high. And what is the gain? A few Taurus missiles who get through and strike into Russia, that's not going to change the outcome of the war. It's only going to draw Germany further into the conflict and perhaps find, an orchid in the middle of Berlin. Who knows?
Daniel, Donald Trump and his policy toward China with the tariff war, do you think that when he perceived that they're not gonna force China to accept whatever they had in their mind, it seems to me that they have learned how important Europe would be if they go after China, if they decide to fight China. Do you think that's one of the reasons that Europe got so much powerful, influential on the case of Ukraine?
I mean, that's certainly a good theory, and that may well be the case. China. I think the administration thinks that this is the same China as in 2017 when Trump 1.0 took over, and it's a very different China. And a lot of that has to do with the sanctions against Russia over Ukraine. Russia has been able to build ties with China, significant ties with China, in something that has never been seen before. And at the same time, China has expanded its influence not through military conquer, as the U.S. likes to do, but through business ties. You see China in Africa increasingly, supplanting France, for example, in Africa. You see China as a peacemaker in the Middle East. It brokered the peace between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which is significant because the U.S. can't use Saudi Arabia's leverage against Iran as it was able to do in the past. So China is forging diplomatic and industrial ties with areas that used to be the purview of the United States, and I think moving into Europe as well. Europe can't afford to stop trade with China. If the U.S. were to slap secondary sanctions on China, anyone who trades with China gets a 100% tariff, it would destroy the Europeans immediately, I think. So China is pivotal now. And of course, the U.S. reaction to that, in rather than finding a way to coexist with China, is looking for, this is the problem with a lot of realists in the United States. They don't want to have a war in Ukraine because they want to go to war with China, because their idea is we have to challenge China on the battlefield rather than compete with them and cooperate with them. I mean, China has incredible technology that's out there because they're not spending $1.5 trillion a year on military conquest, on the military empire. And the U.S. could learn from that, but it's not learning the lessons because what drives Washington is war. And war brings the money. War is the lifeblood of Washington, D.C., and they're not going to let go of that lifeblood.
With the case of Iran, we know that there is a strategic agreement between Iran and Russia. And one of the main points of this agreement is the defense capabilities of the two countries. Do you think that Donald Trump really is he really interested in getting a deal with Iran, or he's just, as we saw with the case of Ukraine, he's just making some sort of moves, but somehow he decides not being able to make any agreement, just getting away from the deal?
Again, it's constant mixed messages. It's impossible to do diplomacy when the target keeps moving. You had Steve Witkoff a few weeks ago say that enrichment is off the table. They can't have any enrichment. And everyone said, well, then how are we going to have a deal? They obviously they have the right to enrichment, even as a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They have a right to it. And then they backed off. And then, they tabled some suggestions that included low-level enrichment for civilian purposes, what have you. And then you had Witkoff come back again and say, just a couple of days ago, saying not even 1% enrichment, and Trump echoed that, to which Khamenei said, well, this is ridiculous, this is absurd, there's no point in talking. And it's an own goal, because they had a deal on the table that just needed ironed out. It's an extremely good deal, and it would be an extremely good deal from Trump's perspective as well, because he could come out and say, I got a better deal than Obama. I don't have this 10-year sunsetting. It's a permanent deal. They're not going to pursue these weapons. Russia will be a guarantor of this agreement. Russia and Iran are close. Russia's going to be, putting up the down payment on this thing, essentially, so to speak, and full inspections. This is a great deal, and I did it. It's the most beautiful, big, beautiful deal you can ever imagine. Perfect. Done. And then he could just check that off the list and go on to something else. But they can't seem to close the deal. And I don't understand why. Now, there's another factor in this, by the way, which is Congress. And that's a big problem. Because, there was a letter sent a couple of weeks ago it was signed by 200 Republicans, including every Republican senator except for Senator Rand Paul, saying that if there is any enrichment in this deal, we will not pass this as a treaty. So therefore, the agreement will be relegated to the level that the Obama agreement was, the JCPOA agreement was, which means that the next administration, if it's more hawkish or what have you, could simply cancel the deal. And that is Congress running interference and basically undermining the foreign policy of a president in their own party. If that happens, Iran is going to look at that and say, well, why are we even talking to these people? Because it's not going to be a treaty. It's not going to be anything that's enshrined in law in the United States. Why are we wasting our energy doing this? So it's almost an impossible task right now, I think.
Daniel, in Trump's visit to the Middle East, to the West Asia, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar, one of the main points was the situation in Syria. And he has announced that he's going to lift all the sanctions on Syria. Here is what Marco Rubio said about Syria.
To the region. When Syria is unstable, the region becomes unstable. And this has certainly been true after the Arab Spring led to the Assad rebellion against Assad, and that really destabilized the entire region. And then it turned Syria, frankly, into a playground for jihadist groups, including ISIS and others, that used it to operate and to destabilize their partners. So you have this change in December. And my view, which I've discussed with many of you individually, is the bad news is that the Transitional Authority figures, they didn't pass their background check with the FBI. Okay, they've got a tough history and one that we understand. But on the flip side of it is, if we engage them, it may work out, it may not work out. If we did not engage them, it was guaranteed to not work out. In fact, it is our assessment that, frankly, the Transitional Authority, given the challenges they're facing, are maybe weeks, not many months, away from potential collapse and a full-scale civil war of epic proportions, basically the country splitting up. The good news is that there is a Syrian national identity. It is one of the places in the Middle East where Alawis and Druze and Christians and Sunni and Shia have lived along, and Kurds have lived alongside each other underneath the banner of a Syrian identity until it was broken by a butcher, Assad, who pitted them against each other. So they face a number of challenges.
Where do you start? Absolutely absurd. First of all, the Syria that he's talking about was created by Assad. The Syria where these different groups get together was created by Assad. And when he talks about the chaos, the destruction, the jihadists that destabilized the country, that was U.S. foreign policy. That was official U.S. foreign policy. You know, in the Trump administration, I mean, in the Obama administration, the U.S. policy was to destabilize. There was a CIA finding. That was the policy of the United States. And now he's somehow ignoring the fact that this is the doing of the United States. Assad was able to keep Syria together, just like Gaddafi was able to keep Libya together until the U.S. interventionists came and decided that they were going to liberate these places. And now that's total chaos. So, I mean, it's just amazing. He's either incredibly stupid or incredibly devious to sit there with a straight face, and complain about the results of the policy that that they put in place in the first place.
I was wondering how they feel that a guy who was somehow he was the head of ISIS, a faction of ISIS. He's gonna be the head of the government in Syria. You look at the picture, Donald Trump staying next to him and Ben MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia. It's just unbelievable how they try to somehow legitimize what's going on in Syria.
I mean, this is the person, you're right, he started the franchise of Al-Qaeda in Syria. He's the person responsible for Sharia law that ruled Idlib province for a number of years. He's the person who was on the back of a motorcycle just 6 months ago with a Kalashnikov on his back, murdering people. This is the guy who murdered and tortured American military members in Iraq. And here he is shaking hands with Donald Trump. I don't know if maybe someone didn't brief Trump properly, but it's definitely it's a shameful chapter in U.S. history to meet someone like this, who, by the way, is still on, I think, the most wanted list. I think they took the 10 million away because people kind of know where to find him now, but he's still on the most wanted list as a terrorist, and he is a terrorist, and he's incapable of ruling. I mean, that's very, very predictable. Al-Qaeda is their job. They've been backed by the U.S. forever. Their job is to break things, smash things up. They're not able to put things together again.
Daniel, to wrap up this session, we have right now, in my opinion, three important issues with the foreign policy of the United States. The one in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and in my opinion, the bigger one, the most important one is the case how to deal with China. And do you see Donald Trump being able to pivot from Ukraine, from Middle East to China, or they're going to do the same as the Biden administration, the Obama administration, Trump 1.0 was doing?
The signs aren't good right now. Ukraine would have been easy to wrap up. He may not have been able to do it in 24 hours as he promised in the campaign trail, but by taking the right steps and saying that this is Biden's war, it's not my war. I'm not going to, wash your hands, do a Pontius Pilate, wash your hands, let them solve it. That could have checked that off the box. Now, the Middle East, it could have been very similar. It would be a bit more difficult to extricate the United States from its relationship with Israel, but there are things the U.S. could have done. Certainly, landing these C-130s chocked to the brim with bunker busters and bombs that are ripping babies to shreds, that would be a good start. Hey, Netanyahu, if you want to do this, knock yourself out, but you're on your own because we're not going to participate in it. That would go a far way towards solving that problem. And then you have built positive relationship with Arab countries in the region that can be very mutually beneficial. You sign the Iran deal and start trading with Iran, very financially beneficial. Let American companies get involved in there and stop trying to overthrow the government, by the way, as well. you have all these issues solved, and you can use the momentum to deal with China. And by deal with, I don't mean, as the realists and the neocons say, militarily, but finding a modus operandi whereby we can both benefit, and that is a great possibility. There's great opportunities for cooperation that would enrich both the U.S. and China. So it's really not that complicated, but you have I don't know, maybe too many cooks in the kitchen. I don't know what the problem is, but the way things are going right now, unless they seriously pull their heads out, it's, yeah, as you say, it's going to just kind of bumble along. And there's a lot of profit in bumbling along, by the way. Let's not forget that. Every one of these crises that is solved means that there's one, there are a few less think tankers, there are a few less, people working, making missiles and all the things that you do when you're in the corridors of power. So there's no profit in peace, unfortunately, right now in the U.S.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
Thank you so much, Nima. Take care.
Take care.